Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Good afternoon from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clement Sedmak and I serve as director of this institute. Welcome to our panel, Focus on Ukraine, Eyewitnesses from the War. As we remember the life of Mikhail Gorbachev, who died yesterday, we find ourselves in a situation that may have seemed unimaginable in the 1990s. A week ago, on August 24, the Nanovic Institute celebrated Ukrainian Independence Day as our opening of the year event. We celebrated together with the Ukrainian Society at the University of Notre Dame and students from the Catholic Ukrainian University in Lviv, who will spend the fall semester here with us in Notre Dame. It was moving to see the sense of solidarity in Nanovic Hall. It was yet another expression of the deep partnership between Notre Dame and Ukraine, especially the Ukrainian Catholic University, whose president, Archbishop Boris Gutsiak, visited our campus in May as our commencement speaker. August 24, Ukrainian Independence Day, was a day of celebrating faith, hope, solidarity, and resilience. It was also a deep reminder of the cost of independence, the fact that independence and freedom are not to be taken for granted. We celebrated the independence of Ukraine. At the same time, we all felt the pain of loss of peace, loss of order, loss of dialogue, loss of respect for international law or basic human standards, but also loss of infrastructure and especially loss of human lives. On August 24, we marked 6 months since the day when Ukraine became a target of Russia's military aggression. The largest war in Europe after World War II has broken out, with unimaginable atrocities, suffering, large-scale migration, but also resilience, heroism, witnesses to faith and freedom, and martyrdom. It is challenging to keep the attention of people focused on one issue over more than 6 months. It is challenging to understand beyond the rather distant and sometimes abstract news about the war that we are dealing with dramatic realities on the ground. Ukraine is close to our heart and on our minds. We have friends and colleagues in the country. Ukraine is a country with a face. We want to contribute to this understanding of Ukraine as a country with a face through today's panel. We want to learn from colleagues who have knowledge by acquaintance about what is happening in Ukraine right now. We want to listen to eyewitnesses to the war. There is a special authority that comes with such witness that we want to honor. The war is real and the war is cruel. Today's BBC summary of the war reads, "Fierce battles have been reported as Ukraine tries to retake the Russian-occupied Kherson region. But military experts have told the BBC any change in control of the southern region, which was seized at the very start of the war, won't happen quickly." BBC also says a team from the United Nations nuclear watchdog has left the Ukrainian capital to inspect the Russian-occupied nuclear power plant. There has been shelling around the facility recently. Our panel today wants to focus on a specific question. What is happening in Ukraine on site, on the ground? What is happening in Ukraine on site, on the ground? We have invited 4 distinguished panelists. I'm so grateful for their presence. May I please introduce them in the order of their input. Dmytro Cherengovsky is Vice Rector for Academic and Internationalization from the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. Welcome, Dmytro, and thank you so much for joining us. Javan O'Grady is Cairo Bureau Chief and Foreign Correspondent from the Washington Post. Thank you, Javan, for joining us, and welcome. Father Dan Grudy, CSC, is Associate Professor of Theology and Global Affairs and Vice President and Associate Provost for Undergraduate Affairs here at Notre Dame. He's a Nanovic Faculty Fellow, and he just visited Ukraine in the first week of July. Father Dan, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome. Taras Stopko is a visiting scholar at the Nanovic Institute for European Studies since January, and he's also the Senior Vice Rector from the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. Taras, thank you so much for joining us once again on the panel. Welcome. I'm very grateful to these experts who will help us navigate the topic. Each panelist will offer an input of, let's say, 8 minutes, and I will try to keep the time. After that, we will have time to engage with questions and comments, and we'll bring this panel to an end at 1:30 after 1 hour. So again, welcome all, and please, dear Dimitro, if I could give the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Dear colleagues, thanks for organizing such panels. It's very important as you and so happening right now. I meet here in Lviv and right now in Ukraine. I feel this solidarity that actually
Dimitro, may I interrupt you for a second? The signal is not very strong, I'm afraid. I don't think that you can do anything about it. Keep trying. If it remains as bad as I think it is now, we may have to wait for your turn and ask, the second speaker to go first. But maybe try again, Dimitro, please.
Okay, I'll try again. Can you hear me right now?
Much better now.
Much better. Okay. So sorry for my signal, and nevertheless, I just want to thank you for organizing this panel, for keeping an eye on Ukraine, and it's quite important to show Ukraine in the news and talk about it as the war is going on, and we desperately need the attention of the international community. Basically, I should admit that I have a background in security studies, so I know a lot about wars. But it was so strange to see the war is going on in Ukraine, just not to read it, not to understand it, but to see and to feel, to see the Russian invasion, to see the output of many people, many brave people of Ukraine who are trying to protect their homeland, who are trying to protect their families. But also, I should admit that it was really hard to see despair at the first days of this war. So we were not thinking if it is possible to combat such a big power. It was really hard to understand if we will survive, especially see the majority of Russian forces, missiles attacks, military who are coming here. It was really hard to see many of families that are destroyed. It was really hard to see the number of my friends who were moving from southern part of Ukraine and eastern part of Ukraine, crossing my own Lviv city, crossing Ukrainian border, just simply to survive. But it was really important, and it was really motivating to see the face that people had in their hearts. At first, we were frightened. Then we see and understand that it is possible to combat. And then we feel that we need each other. To be Ukrainian, that was a special word. To be Ukrainian, that means that you have something in your heart, you have something in your mind, and you are ready to contribute to others. Suddenly, in terms of war, we suddenly understand that you can bring all your experience as an educator or as a military person, or for example, as a researcher, as a business person, as a priest, whatever who you are, just bring your personal experience to help others. And I think that feeling that we are sharing until right now is a miracle. So I never witnessed and to feel it by myself, that I can bring something deep from my heart, and that I can bring something that I was trained or not even trained to do to help other people. I was not so important than my ability to help other people. So I think that is that is keeping us right now. But I also should admit that actually today is the end of the summer, but we all Ukrainians are living in February. And even right now, that is quite stressful, and it hardly be understood by the many of the nations, like simple things. We can't plan for the longer period of time. So I think one of the striking things is that I stopped planning more than 1 year, and many of my friends and people stopped planning more than 1 year. As a university administrator, I should do this. So it's really hard to understand how you can do it. But also, this very critically important to have a good team and to share this despair, to share this weakness, but also to find strengths and do step by step together. So, and here, luckily, we have international community who is ready to help within these things. It was also very stressful, and it is right now, to see the flows of migration. Luckily, Lviv city that is located at the western part of Ukraine was not bombed and shelled so much. So only a few buildings and a few infrastructure centers were actually destroyed, but the majority of the hittings and missile attacks are happening right now at the southern part of Ukraine and at the eastern part of Ukraine. So it is really important right now for us being in such having a little privilege. So you understand, we have a privilege of being at war, but being in a relatively safe position to help to the others. And I think that feeling of how you can help, what you can do, very practical, that is what Ukrainians are sharing to each other. Despite who you are, what background you have, what face you are sharing, from which city you are, we are all Ukrainians together. That's keeping us. Nevertheless, it's quite important right now for us to think how we can not only sustain in this war, and how we can actually fight for the to win this war. And many sociological researchers are showing that while at the first days it was a question whether we can stand as a nation, whether we can sustain as a state, right now the majority of people are sharing only one idea: when we can win. So what is exact time that we can put all our efforts and win? And right now we are thinking, and many of Ukrainians are thinking, what will be the next steps? Because we definitely understand that we should use this war as an opportunity for the social transformation, to ruin many stereotypes, but also to bring something new, to bring more fair society, to bring more successful society, to bring the society where the person and the idea of a person in any act of the policy making, any act of social making is present. We feel this weakness during the wartime, and we want to build our state based on this weakness. So basically, right now, while this day, even today, we have the probable missile attacks on Ukraine, nevertheless, Ukrainians are dreaming about the future. And that is why, once more, it's quite important to save the human capital and to help Ukraine to build a successful nation state. Here, what is needed actually is the international support, international eyes, but also what is needed here is to understand that the world is staying together with Ukraine, that the world is sharing the same principles of democracy, of respect to human dignity, and all the countries are ready together with Ukraine actually to not only to recover Ukraine, but actually to build all our prosperous future, take into account these hard lessons that Ukrainians have right now and paying their lives for that.
Thank you so much, Dimitro. I repeat some of those sentences that go to heart. It is hard to see despair. It is motivating to see faith in the hearts. We feel that we need each other. It is a miracle. We can't plan long term. What are the next steps? and standing together in Ukraine and standing together with Ukraine is what we need now to think about the future. Thank you so much. May I please ask Javan, staff writer on the foreign desk at the Washington Post, to offer her inputs and expertise. Thank you so much, Javan.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm looking forward to hearing all of my co-panelists' views and sharing my experience as a journalist who has spent much of the year working in Ukraine. In early March, I stood by the broken bridge that once connected the city of Irpin to the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. It was snowing. Artillery shelling boomed close by. On a makeshift platform on the river, throngs of civilians, some sobbing, others stoic, helped each other cross to what they hoped would be safety. Some carried the elderly in bed sheets or pushed them in wheelbarrows, scrambling up a muddy path to the road. I can still vividly remember one old woman wearing only slippers on her feet, who was carried across in a tarp, her eyes wide with fear. I watched another man push through the crowd, an anti-tank rocket slung over one of his shoulders and a crying toddler in his arms. Some people clung to their cats and dogs. Others wept as they described having to leave their pets behind. For 2 weeks already at that point, I had been reporting nonstop on Russia's violent invasion of Ukraine. I landed in Ukraine on February 21st, before the full-scale war began. I was there on assignment alongside several other journalists from the Washington Post, who were covering Russia's military buildup in the region and US warnings Moscow might be planning to invade. Then, early on February 24th, I woke up to the sounds of war in Kyiv. That morning, my Ukrainian colleague, Kostya Khudov, fled his apartment with a backpack and his dog. Cars were streaming out of the city. Many people feared the capital would fall within days, if not sooner. Kostya drove the opposite direction, straight to my hotel downtown. With other colleagues, we rushed to the train station where we found thousands of people, Ukrainians and foreign residents, rushing to flee west. As a sort of involuntary coping mechanism, I had to set aside any fears about my own safety or even thoughts about the bigger picture and focus only on what was directly in front of me each day. My team slept on the floor in our hotel's basement each night, often writing in relative safety until the early hours of the morning, thanks to the bravery of several Ukrainian hotel staff who stayed behind to feed us and keep the building running, risking their own lives to do so. During the day, we sought out stories that showed the bravery and compassion of Ukrainians who were making gut-wrenching decisions over what to do with their families and homes as they faced the unthinkable. I spent an evening in a makeshift maternity ward in a hospital where babies were delivered in a dimly lit basement to ensure the lights could be kept off upstairs and not attract any Russian attack. I went to the Kyiv Zoo, where I met caretakers who had moved into zoo buildings with their families to keep feeding animals terrified by the sounds of shelling, including an elephant who was exhibiting signs of distress and 2 elderly giraffes. I met volunteers cleaning up damaged apartment buildings, teenagers running a Molotov cocktail factory in a basement, and a 17-year-old who dug a trench in Obolon and was defending it alongside his father. I met women at a church cooking traditional Ukrainian food for soldiers on the front line, singing Ukrainian folk songs as they folded dough between their fingers. In those weeks, our stories reached millions of readers around the world, and we were gratified to see that our eyewitness testimony was spurring so much concern over what was unfolding in Ukraine. But it wasn't until I reached the broken bridge that day in March that I allowed myself the space to more fully assess for myself what I had been witnessing. The scene encapsulated so much of the helplessness of people caught in the middle of this horrible war. Many brave civilians stopped that day, even as they ran to safety, to tell us what they had seen over the last 2 weeks. They described indiscriminate shooting, Russian tanks and snipers operating in civilian areas, and terrified families huddled in basements and shelters. Electricity, gas, water, and cell networks had been cut off, leaving those inside cold, hungry, thirsty, and unable to communicate with the outside world. What they told us only confirmed our worst fears about what was happening in areas that were at the time too dangerous for us to reach, that there would likely be a horrific civilian toll from the fighting around the capital. When Russian forces finally retreated from their initial attempt to take Kyiv, the disaster left in their wake confirmed that to be true. Bodies littered the streets in the small towns surrounding the capital. Others were buried in mass graves. I left Ukraine in April and returned in late May, this time heading to the country's east. I spent around a month working in Donbass, again alongside my brave Ukrainian and foreign colleagues. There, I reported on the brutality of the artillery war and the horrors of civilians living under constant shelling, following doctors and volunteers as they attempted to treat the wounded and evacuate the vulnerable, and embedding with soldiers on the front line. I witnessed horrible injuries and damage to civilian infrastructure, including apartment buildings where people were killed in their own homes. I personally came under direct shelling twice, including once from suspected cluster munitions on the front line. We hid under a tank with Ukrainian soldiers as munitions exploded around us, and then ran for our lives through the woods as more continued to explode all around us. The experience, while terrifying, left me with a better understanding of the brutality of this war, and of shelling in particular. As one Ukrainian commander told me about Russian forces that month, they don't hold a city until they destroy it. I left the country in late June and will head back next week to continue my coverage. I'm often asked what it was like to be there when the war began and to work as a journalist in Ukraine. The most important answer I can give is that while it is tremendously difficult, none of it would be possible without the immense courage of our Ukrainian colleagues, from our drivers who ensure our safety near the front line to the journalists we work with for translation and co-reporting. I continue to fervently hope for their safety and well-being, especially as they go through the trauma of reporting on the horrors of war from their own country, a job that is much more difficult than my own. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. Obviously, your words speak for themselves. Just this image of the makeshift maternity ward and then the life in the zoo that has to go on. Your own experience of being shelled, and then your sober statement, it helps me understand much better what people are going through, and your expression of respect for Ukrainian colleagues. Thank you so much, and all the best already at this point for your returning to Ukraine next week, Siobhan. Thank you so much for your input and for your eyewitness. We as those in safe countries really appreciate the risk that you take to help us be informed in a very good way. Thank you. Father Dan, our Vice President, who was in Ukraine in the first week of July, thank you so much for being with us. May I please ask you for your input? Thank you, Father Dan.
Sure, and thank you, Clemens and Siobhan. Thank you so much for the very moving, thick description of kind of what's happening on the ground. I'm just going to share just some brief thoughts that came from our visit there from June 30th to July 6th. I came at the invitation of Archbishop Boris Gutsiak. Clemens was also invited to come, but was not able to make it. But Archbishop Gutsiak, as you know, was our graduation speaker here at Notre Dame. And because of my own work in refugees and migrants, he asked if I'd come to just see some of the situation there. So Yuri Amermakov, who teaches in our theology department, he's from Russia, and but he teaches here now, also was there, as well as Ben Worthman from Catholic Charities, who's the vice president of behavioral health. And there were also some diplomats from Europe, Ukraine, and elsewhere who joined us. And we landed in Poland, then we drove down to Ukraine, and we were also there during our 4th of July. So it was an important space for us to reflect on really freedom and the price of freedom. So I think a lot of people coming from the United States often take this for granted, but often don't realize the high cost that's involved in really fighting for freedom. So I just want to lay out just a few of the places we visited, and then some of the kind of characteristics that struck me. We were not involved in the battle in the same kind of way that Siobhan was. We were in Lviv, and as Dmitry said, there has been some bombings there. Occasionally the sirens would go off, but there was very much a contradiction and sometimes going on at the same time. There's a war all around us that you could not always see, but as you dug beneath the surface, you could really see the layers of which it's affecting the whole fabric of society. So we went to the Regno Logistical Center, which is a humanitarian aid center. It was very impressive to see the role of the Catholic University in helping do anything it could through its students, through its resources, through its programs to try to do outreach. But it was also impressive to see how people would redeploy their own lives in ways that were directed towards humanitarian aid. So in this particular place, someone who had a truck driving company really ended up using the trucks to really provide humanitarian support. It was impressive, the logistics, the panel of really logistics that really were part of this whole operation, but trying to sort of constantly send out streams of clothing and food and medical supplies to the front line. We also went to the Truskovets Military Hospital, where you could really see in real time soldiers who had lost limbs, people who came back to the centers wounded, and the people trying to help them. They gave us extraordinary hospitality, but at the same time, under a tremendous amount of stress and duress that were there. So you can see, again, places that were one-time resorts are now kind of used for military relief in different parts of Ukraine. We also met with Caritas Ukraine, who's really trying to address the situation of the internally displaced people and the refugees, and are trying to deal with the psychological traumas that are also kind of connected with us. So there's a lot of direct service that's in terms of basic needs for people, but there's also these longer term wounds that are coming about because of trauma. We went to some of the IDP, internally displaced people centers that were there, people who are living in basically restructured trailer containers with a higher standard than I've seen in other places. So it's impressive to see the government was using everything it could to try to take people from Donbass or southern Ukraine and to bring them to places like Lviv where it's safer to have some temporary shelter and some protection. But lastly, we kind of spent a lot of time at the Catholic University of Ukraine, and Notre Dame has a commitment that, to this university and helping doing some exchange programs with its students and its faculty, but also to see the internal operations of how a place is doing just immense work and very impressive work through. There was a Vatican conference there about trying to understand why the Pope hasn't spoken directly on this issue. About Russia and its criminal invasion. But there are many things there, the people we met with the business school and others, too many to mention. But I just want to mention one piece that was interesting to me. As a priest, I celebrated Byzantine liturgy there for the first time. I didn't really know what I was doing, and it was kind of a good symbol of that. I'm part of something that I'm connected to. There's a deeper layer of understanding that I feel connected to. But the words and the culture and the spirit, many ways, it was foreign to me. So, but that was a good kind of metaphor for kind of trying to understand really my experience of Ukraine, because while there's a common humanity and a shared spirit and a sense of solidarity and empathy, I could only observe sometimes the way that people responded. And Dmytro said this kind of matter of factly, but I think for me it struck me very, very much directly, and that was the mind and heart of the Ukrainian people. And the first I'd say to this is there was a strong spirit of identity, that they say, we're Ukrainian, and that we have a strong sense of determination to really decide what our destiny is going to be about, and we're not going to let other people do that. So there's a great sense of who they are as Ukrainians, but in a very humanitarian very human sort of way, not just sort of a balkanized kind of way. The second was immense amount of courage with this huge mountain to climb. They're like, it's when we're going to win, not if we're going to win. That really struck me, I think, very strongly. But the third is also there's a spirit of life, and that they see this not just as who's going to be in the government and how are we going to rearrange the chairs about who's in charge, but it's saying, no, this is about genocide, that this is not just about Russia sort of taking over. This is about them getting rid of us. And to get the feeling of Poland and Ukraine and the Jews who were there, who had already lived through World War II, very much part of the living memory. So the mind and the heart of the Ukrainian people was impressive and inspirational. And so while there was this tremendous war going on around you, you saw this life kind of breaking forth that couldn't be really snuffed out. The second piece would really be the pernicious problem of empire. So as a theologian looking at this, you see an old narrative taking shape in a new way. So you have this biblical notion of empire, which is any kind of organization or government, in this case, that truly arrogates to itself the power that belongs to God and to God alone, manifesting itself in new ways. So where in the past it would have been Assyria, Persia, Asia, Rome, today China or the US, now it's really Russia. But how deep this was, and how deep I think are some of the protagonists, whereas in the past it's the Herods or the Pharaohs, now it's really the Putins of the world. And to hear this through interlocutors from Russia to tell me this is the way it works. For Russia, it's about empire. There was one story where someone said to me that Putin was on television with a young kind of spelling bee champion or something. And he asked the young man, he said, where are the borders of Russia? So the young man said, they're here, they're here, they're here. And Putin said, no, there are no borders to Russia. So there's a sense of just really trying not only to reclaim what they had, but to really dominate in a way that subjugates at any cost. So really this tremendous spirit of courage in the face of empire was really striking. So lastly, I just want to just share with you just some takeaways for me, that some of which I'm really struggling with. These are more questions sometimes than answers, but I think things that I'm really kind of wrestling with coming from this space. But the first was really, it's a place of war and peace. If you walk around Ukraine in the Catholic University, on the one hand, people are walking in parks, they're holding hands, they're going to cafes. But on the other hand, as you dig beneath the surface, there's 6 funerals a day at the local church. Families have already lost loved ones. Students have already lost some of their classmates. So all this stuff is going on at the same time. At the surface in Lviv, you don't see a war, but it's really something that pervades and invades every part of society. The second was really about justice and reconciliation. There was quite a bit of stir that the Vatican had actually proposed to do away with the cross during Holy Week of a Russian woman and a Ukrainian woman. So from my outside perspective, that was a vision of solidarity. But from the inside, they said this was very offensive. So this was one of those things that I just felt like I had to sit with and contemplate, not fully understanding. And people were saying this would be the equivalent of trying to forgive someone while you're being raped, and it's just, when's the timing of this and how to really work that through. So those struggles about justice and reconciliation were very much in live time. The second one, personally, between just war and nonviolence. War is stupid. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's such a waste of people, of resources, of time, of energy. But on the other hand, there are huge kind of core values at stake. And you can see people really trying to wrestle with, in this case, what it means to be a person of faith in the midst of a war, and really trying to work that out with really no simple answers. And lastly, I would just say it was like the best of times and the worst of times going on at the same time. The worst of times, in which Siobhan described so powerfully, but the best of times in bringing out really what is the best in people: music, art, but also people really kind of going deep into their own sense of humanity to say, we will lay down our lives for the sake of our people and those who are in need. So really, in that sense, bringing out the best in people. And my hope is that in some sense, those can be some of the seeds of resurrection in the midst of what is already a huge and very difficult war going on right now.
Thank you so much, Father Dan, for your reflections, for your expression of admiration for the mind and heart of the Ukrainian people and their courage, for the reminder that what is at stake is really life or death. You used words like genocide and empire. For your reflections on the new role of a Catholic university in times of war, where UKU does so much more than teach students and does research these days. And for your reflections on a place of war and peace, the worst of times and the best of times. And that, of course, gives us a lot of hope. And as you also said, an understanding of how limited our understanding is of such a complex context that we face. Professor Dobko is our last panelist. Taraj, thank you so much for being with us. You know so much about Ukraine, but since January, you're here in the United States, and we're very happy to have you. Thank you so much for your input, given your eyewitnesses of eyewitnesses. I think that's what you're going to do. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Clemens. As you mentioned, I'm here at Notre Dame even before the war started, and so I don't have a first-hand, on-the-ground experience of the war in Ukraine, but I would like, still to start with kind of 3 personal experiences that, shattered me deeply in the first weeks of the war, and then I will move to discussing what I think is probably the most vulnerable solidarity factor in the current global support attempt to secure support and justice for Ukraine. And here I will talk about public opinion in the West as a solidarity factor, important one. So first, in the first weeks of the war, I felt actually devastated by a painful feeling of the possibility of losing home, kind of the physical and spiritual space to which I belong, to where I belong. Normally, we took the fact of having home for granted. And suddenly, the terror of becoming homeless in a fundamental sense was so strong that I could hardly function during the first weeks, of the aggression. I realized that I and my family might never come back home, and I could very directly relate not only to the experience of millions of people living at that time, fleeing Ukraine at that time, but also many Ukrainians who were forced to leave their homes behind while fleeing from the Soviet occupation in the last months of World War II. Let me make it kind of very clear. If you know history well, you will discover that whenever Russia would occupy any land with the Ukrainian Eastern Catholic population, it led to the destruction of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, its institutions, and its faithful very often. So if Russia succeeded in the occupation of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Catholic University would cease to exist. That's simple. So with the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we really had to consider even worst-case scenario evacuation. And I must confess, I couldn't reconcile myself with even the thought that we should think about such a possibility. So my body protested against it. So finally, during the last week of February and first weeks of March, I appreciated very strongly the meaning of the lyrics of the American anthem, so the Star-Spangled Banner, as never before. I learned the story of Francis Scott Key as a story of the battle for Kyiv. We couldn't sleep at the time at nights, waking up 3-4 times and checking if Kyiv is still free and unoccupied. We were looking for, I quote, proof through the night that our flag was still there. Ukrainians succeeded in defending their capital and pushing Russians away from Kyiv and other cities in northern and northeast Ukraine. A few days ago, it's a very interesting story. So the Washington Post reconstructed actually these events and based on interviews of more than 100 people. And it shows the stories that it took much sacrifice, perseverance, and heroism to defeat Russians and make them retreat, from Kyiv. In early March, we started getting news about the loss of our university's alumni, staff, and their immediate relatives. And I mentioned on the Independence Day last week a story of Artemy Demid, who was 27 years old, Ukrainian Marine, and he was killed by a mortar shell. And when I hear such stories, I keep thinking, just imagine what it takes to raise such a young person. It takes hard and gentle work of a loving family, friends, and many other people who leave their trace on a person's character. It takes many institutions like schools or universities, NGOs, churches, which provides a space for developing this personality, character, and professional skills as well. It takes a lot of people, work, time, resources to educate such bright people and prepare them for a productive life. So the war is really stupid thing. It's very cruel things, and we lose such people because of that war. Then there came shattering news about the atrocities of Russian soldiers at Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, Borodyanka, and other Ukrainian towns and villages. And I must confess, from this point on, it was clear for me that Ukrainians will not surrender. The genocidal intent, which became evident in these atrocities and war crimes, as well as in the Russian propaganda playbooks, made it clear that Ukrainians must win this war. Enough is enough. We understand that the forces are not equal, but it fell to the current generation of Ukrainians to defeat this Russian imperialism. And our hope is that Ukraine will prevail. Actually, 93% of Ukrainians believe that Ukraine will be able to repel Russia's aggression. 93% of Ukrainian refugees want to come back at some time, not immediately, only immediately 11%, but at some time when the peace is reached and safety established. So to a large extent, this optimism is well grounded in the fact that for the first time in the last 100 years, Ukraine's independence has this vast international support. So Russia failed to subjugate Ukraine militarily. With Western support, Ukrainians have already destroyed at least 1/3 of Russia's military capabilities. Unable to win on the battlefield, the Russian plan at this point seems to be, as Timothy Snyder puts it, I quote, to destroy the Ukrainian economy, to terrorize civilians with missile attacks on cities, to cut energy supplies to Europeans, and to starve Africans and Asians by blockading food exports, and hope that somehow all of the suffering lines up in Russia's favor, end of quote. The end point of this strategy is to convince public opinion in the West that Ukraine cannot win. I agree here, with Abraham Lincoln, who said that, I quote, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed, end of quote. So public opinion is the wild card, according to Snyder, into public opinion in the West. I would like to turn now. So Ivan Krastev, one of the interesting political thinkers, cites Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times that, I quote, the war in Ukraine is essentially being fought on three fronts and among three protagonists. The first front is the battlefield itself. The second front is economic. The third front is the battle of wills. The three participants are Russia, Ukraine, and the Western alliance backing Ukraine, end of quote. We know well that Ukrainian defense and resilience capabilities depend on Western support, military as well as financial. And public opinion is a key factor in determining the position of democratic Western governments in this war. I firmly believe that in Kremlin's imagination, public opinion is the weakest link in Ukraine's defense. Therefore, we should expect a massive attempt by the Russian propaganda to convince Western citizens that they should not sacrifice anything for the sake of Ukraine. And conversely, it is important for Ukraine and its partners to convey to people in the West the global significance of Ukraine's victory over revisionist Russia. Thus, already in end of January, before the war, a poll conducted by Ivan Krastev and supported by the European Council on Foreign Relations made it clear that Europeans were divided with respect to their view on the severity of sanctions that should punish Russia in case it invades Ukraine. Poles, Romanians, and Swedes were ready to bear greater inconveniences to deter Russia than Germans, French, Finns, and Italians. Ukrainian political analyst Mikhailo Dubinyansky believes that the Kremlin would like to sell to contemporary Western audiences three messages. The first message: it's impossible for Ukraine to win this war. Moscow is selling to the West a simulacrum, the illusion of Russian invincibility. To make this illusion work, the Kremlin will be ready to bluff even after exhausting its resources. I mean, to deliver purely demonstrative attacks on Ukraine and commit suicidal actions that have no real military significance, with one single goal in mind: to convince the Western world that Ukraine's victory is impossible. The second message: Ukraine is no better than us. By committing war crimes and terrorizing civilians, Russia is trying to provoke us into symmetrical brutality and thus discredit Ukraine in the eyes of the Western public opinion. The Kremlin tries to convince us that the status of a victim gives to Ukrainians carte blanche to any methods of war. And the more brutal and uncivilized Ukrainians will look, the more likely a Westerner will equate the victim of aggression with the aggressor. Third message: this is not your war. Let Slavs to solve their disagreements between themselves. To make the West step aside, the argument goes as follows: this is a distant, far-away region with its own specificity and complexity. Everything there is too complicated, confusing, and unclear. Therefore, Ukrainian affairs is not your business. And these observations have been in part confirmed by the findings of the Pan-European Opinion poll in mid-May, again conducted by the European Council on Foreign Relations across 10 countries. It revealed, I quote, that Europe's remarkable unity in the early days of the war is under threat from an emerging split between those who want peace as soon as possible and those who favor justice for Ukraine, end of quote. The public debate is turning away from events on the battlefield and towards questions of how the conflict will end, as well as its impact on people's lives, on their countries. High inflation, energy, and food crisis. So Europeans are most concerned about two issues: the cost of living and the threat of the use of nuclear power by Russia. On the one hand, there is strong support across all countries for severing all economic ties with Russia. But on the other hand, in all countries apart from Poland, the peace camp is larger than the justice camp. So how to work with public opinion in the West? First, Ukrainians need victories that can be presented to public opinion in the West as evidence of Russian vulnerability and Ukraine's ability to win the war. Second, Ukrainian defenders should remember that the end does not justify the means, and we must remain sufficiently civilized and democratic so that our cause looks worthy in the eyes of the Western public. Third, Ukrainians need to be as close and familiar to a Westerner as possible. It's not enough to be brave and resilient. And let me finish by invoking a biblical image. Despite King Saul's warnings and doubts, David managed to defeat Goliath. There are many opinion makers like King Saul in relation to Ukraine today, and many are their doubts and warnings. Some Western politicians and intellectuals are still under spell of the myth of Russia's invincibility and try to find a way to contain or deter evil, if not to normalize it. Some international human rights organizations exhibit moral blindness by putting the victim of aggression and the aggressor on the same level and thus blurring the line between good and evil. Even Vatican diplomacy shows the lack of understanding and sensitivity to what is going on in Ukraine. The battle of wills goes on, and Ukraine's dependence on Western support in this war means that who wins this battle of wills is likely to be no less important than what takes place on the economic and military fronts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taras, also for the image of David and Goliath. Asking this question, what does it take to raise a young person? How many institutions, how many gestures, how many individual people? Talking about this wonderful sentence, public sentiment is everything. Public sentiment is everything. And that's why we are trying to have those kinds of panels to keep the issue and perspectives of the issue alive. Dear audience, please, if you have any questions, submit them through the link above the live stream on the Nanovic website. We have already some questions. There is one for Shavan, if I may. And the question is, if you look at international reporting, at international journalism in Ukraine, how has it changed since you first came early in this year and now it's in the beginning of the second half of the year? How has it changed?
That's a great question. And it's one that I get a lot, actually. And I think it often comes along with a sort of accusation that there isn't as much coverage as there was, which I would like to push back against, having been part of a team that's been on the ground in huge numbers since the beginning. I think that international news outlets continue to report very aggressively on the war, but that if folks aren't reading it as much or seeing it in their news feeds or seeking it out, then that is partially on them also as the reader, as much as it is, of course, there's still a responsibility among journalists to continue coverage, but I think that we have been doing so. I guess one change that I have seen is just a greater understanding of the conflict and the social dynamics in Ukraine. I'm the first to admit that I was not an expert on Ukraine. I'm still not an expert on Ukraine. Obviously, my title is Cairo Bureau Chief. I was one of several foreign correspondents tapped to go just as almost a precaution before the war and was thrown into this situation. And I think it's been great to see how many of us are crediting our local colleagues and how many Ukrainian names we're seeing on international media as well. And I also think, I mean, the main difference would be that at the beginning, there was a massive focus on the battle for Kyiv, and there was a perception based on, reporting from US intelligence and other, foreign intelligence agencies that Kyiv would fall. It wasn't really a matter of if, it was a matter of when. And so all of us were preparing for our potential need to escape from the country, and what that would look like. And, I think that there was a massive underestimation globally of the willingness of Ukrainians to fight. And I remember meeting people in those first weeks, grandmothers telling me, I will kill a Russian with my bare hands if I have to. I mean, that was the kind of attitude that Ukrainians had. And I had, one story that's my dad's favorite story of any quote I got during the war. I met a young guy who had never used an AK-47 before. And I asked him, do you even know how to shoot it? He was holding it. And he said, well, it's like a spoon. Anyone can use one. So people were just like prepared to do whatever it took, I think. And that was something that journalists focused on, obviously, throughout, but that the intelligence didn't reflect. So there were competing narratives at the beginning of the war. And now I think we're seeing, much more focus on the battle in the East and South, as the battle has shifted there, but there's still a lot of concern about what might still happen in the capital in the months to come.
Thank you, Shawan. And again, thank you for what you do to help us understand what's happening. And the question was innocent, without any implication of, well, you do less than you used to.
No, I understand. I just wanted to emphasize that because I think also just in general news consumption, people who are often getting their news from social media sites might think that it's slowed down, but I think it's important to remember that that's curation, and that if you go directly to news websites like the Washington Post, New York Times, BBC, you'll see that Ukraine is continuing to be at the top of our coverage as one of our main objectives. Yeah.
And we are grateful for that. I have a question for Dimitru coming in. It's about long-term trauma. So there may be the short-term aspects of the war, and how do you see being on the ground the long-term challenges also for mental health and just building a normal society, quote unquote, after peace has come?
Yeah, thank you. This is one of the most important questions because we are not traumatized only physically.
Yep.
Many of people are traumatized physically. There are many rapes, there are many killings, but also we are traumatized mentally. And that is very important question, how to recover. But I think what we are having here is definitely dark times, but at the same period of time, this is a good school. So you can never imagine, but some things about ourselves, about our behavior, about the social transformations that we are seeing right here in 3 hours, in one day. That is something that other nations who have actually a possibility to live without war are learning in years. So everything is very fast here, extremely fast here. Yeah. And this is a good school. This is a good school, and this school brings a lot of knowledge how to deal with people. I mean, school in different ways, like in mental ways, but also in very physical ways. So I would rather say that many of my friends who are soldiers, but also who are, for example, doctors who work in medicine, so they are great professionals right now because there's such a great amount of cases. And that's what we bring here. So we are trying right now to appreciate what we have, and trying to build on what we have. So definitely there will be a number of the challenges, but I think that having learned like these lessons, bringing resources in these lessons, but also bringing like the classical international knowledge into these lessons, but have these practitioners who experience that, who brought it from their heart to help, that can cure a lot. That can cure a lot.
Thank you, Dimitri, also for this hopeful point about the good school. There's so much we all can learn from Ukraine these days, and to put this knowledge to good use. There's a question for Father Dan. Taraj mentioned the peace camp is bigger than the justice camp in Europe. And you also reflect a little bit about reconciliation and justice. Could you elaborate on that? Where do you see this going with looking at the future of Ukraine, the justice camp and the peace camp, and what should be done?
Ideally and hopefully they go together. And I think for me, it's just a matter of timing. And I guess that's where I came away with. As much as I think there's a vision of saying when we kill our Russian brother, something ourselves dies. I think that vision of solidarity has to be alive beyond borders. And the war really is also fought within each one of us. I was struck by the workers from Catholic Charity, from Caritas, who said that in working with the refugees there, one of the things that they're really dealing with is the hatred that people have towards the Russians. And if we end there, then the Russians have won. I mean, in that sense. And I think part of winning is also a love that's greater than the hatred. So, but I even words like that can strike people as hollow when you're being shelled and undergoing the violence. So for me, it's a question of how you work towards that vision of saying, yes, even these Russians are part of our human community, and we're connected to them, whether we see it that way or not. But I think it's too soon. I think they'd say right now, what I heard them saying is that even if that's the case, it's too soon to even be able to speak of that, because we're just under such siege right now.
Yeah.
So I honestly, I feel like I'm listening more than commenting on that. And I feel like they're the ones who have to lead that process of what reconciliation really looks like. But hopefully it won't end just on war and hatred.
Yeah, thank you, Father Dan. I remember when Archbishop Boris Gutsiak was on campus, he said, Christian message, love your enemy. It is very real for us. That's basically all he said.
Very
it's
concrete.
very real for us. Yeah. Taras, a question for you. It's about the mission of a Catholic university. You're senior vice rector. You were senior vice rector of UCO in the peaceful times. Now you're senior vice rector of UCO in a war situation. How do you see a change in the mission of a Catholic university, given your experience over the last months?
Yeah, thank you for a very good question. I would make actually 2 points. First of all, when there is some emergency situation, kind of the third mission, as it is called, of the university becomes probably one of the most important. I mean, social service. So I mean, being with the people. And this was actually exercised by not only by our university, but also many other universities in Ukraine with respect to, for example, universities which operation was interrupted by the war from these affected areas, so they were receiving, students, or some universities would kind of become a base for the displaced universities from these areas. So solidarity as a virtue of also academic life. So I think becomes very important, and that academic environment is also a place for character formation. So I think this is what became very visible and important. And the second point is about the future. So universities are communities, are institutions that articulate the vision for the country. And I think when the Ukrainian university should become those like beacon, of this new vision about which Dmitro spoke, and which is very important for healing, for peacemaking, and for justice as well. So because if you have a vision of a flourishing country, even if you have to work very hard to achieve it, so it will help also to overcome psychological challenges and traumas, which will be an issue in Ukraine, as you mentioned just a few minutes ago.
Thank you, Taras. Third mission and helping with the vision. This is very helpful. We have 2 minutes, so I have to bring this to a close. And I would ask each of you, dear panelists, to give me one short sentence on the question that was just submitted. How can we best show solidarity with Ukraine? How can we best show solidarity with Ukraine? I will start with Shavan and end with Dimitro. Shavan, how can we best show solidarity with Ukraine?
Keep reading about it, keep writing about it, and sharing about it. Don't let it become the norm, and don't let yourself become complacent.
Thank you, Shavan. Taras, how can we best show solidarity and express solidarity with Ukraine?
I think it's important I continue what was said, to learn to understand Ukraine in its own terms. And it's important to keep Ukraine high on agenda of Western societies, especially during the time of the war, which could kind of risk to become a protracted war.
Thank you. Thank you, Taras. Father Dan, one short sentence expressing solidarity with Ukraine.
I think it's a mutual solidarity, and it's to keep hope alive and to express that in concrete actions.
Thank you. Dimitro, you have the last word from the panelists. How can we express solidarity with your country?
I think that you should use Ukraine as methodology. Have to act and build your knowledge on using Ukraine and together with Ukraine. And so whenever you feel here secure, come here, study together with us, see in our eyes what we can bring to actually to society, how we can built more in our solidarity, more prosperous society.
Thank you so much. And obviously the partnership between Notre Dame and the Ukrainian Catholic University is an expression of lived solidarity. And you give us your guidance. We are grateful for that because there's a lot of goodwill and it has to be channeled. Dear all, we are at time. We want to thank our panelists for their participation and their input. It was moving, also heartbreaking, but also hopeful. All good wishes, especially to Dimitro on the ground and to Shavan returning to Ukraine very soon. Please be safe and take care. We want to thank all of our audience for your interest and your questions. And we want to thank our colleagues who made the panel possible, especially Tim Checkley, Grant Osborne, Grania McAvoy, and Becca Prince. Let me end with one little paragraph. On the day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our university president, Father Jenkins, has issued a statement where he said, "The former oppressors of Ukraine are now known by another name and are waging war on a different flag. But the trauma is no less today than in the past in this nation that has suffered far too much. Now, more than ever, our friends in Ukraine are in need of healing and hope. We at Notre Dame stand in solidarity with all peace-loving people worldwide, demanding an end to this invasion of a sovereign nation. This unprovoked war is an international abomination and must stop now. Until it does, may God keep safe all of the innocent men, women, and children who are currently in harm's way. The prayers of the Notre Dame family are with them." With these prayers for peace, we from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies want to wish all of you a good and safe afternoon. Thank you so much. God bless.